People said old hands were useless, until the night the entire town went dark, and the only people who knew how to bring the lights back were the ones everyone had forgotten. The storm rolled into Cedar Bay just after midnight. Rain slammed against the windows hard enough to rattle the old glass, and the ocean beyond the harbor sounded angry, restless, alive. One by one, the lights across town disappeared until the entire coastline sank into darkness. The grocery store lost power first, then the gas station, then the marina. Cell phones stopped working within minutes after the communication towers failed in the heavy wind. By 12:30, even the emergency backup systems downtown had gone silent. People stood on porches holding flashlights, staring into the blackness while sirens echoed somewhere near the coast. Inside Whitmore Repair Shop, however, a warm amber light still glowed behind the dusty front windows. The old generator in the back room coughed twice before settling into a steady rumble. Arthur Whitmore tightened the collar of his faded flannel shirt and walked slowly toward the workbench where dozens of old radios sat lined up beside rusted toolboxes and neatly organized drawers of screws, wires, and vacuum tubes. At 72 years old, Arthur moved more carefully than he used to, but his hands still remembered things the rest of the world had forgotten. Outside, rainwater rushed down Harbor Street in silver streams while the wooden sign above his shop creaked in the wind. Whitmore Repair Shop. The paint had faded years ago. Most people barely noticed it anymore. 3 months earlier, Arthur had seriously considered taking the sign down for good. Business had nearly vanished in Cedar Bay. The younger generation bought new things instead of repairing old ones. Broken radios went into trash bins. Old clocks were replaced by phones. Nobody used typewriters anymore. Even record players had become decorations in expensive beach houses owned by tourists from Boston and New York. Every morning Arthur still unlocked the front door at exactly 7:30, even when he knew no customers would come. He would sweep the floorboards, boil water for tea, and dust shelves filled with forgotten machines that nobody wanted anymore. Some afternoons, the only sound inside the shop was the ticking of an old wall clock above the counter and the distant cry of seagulls outside the harbor. The loneliness did not arrive suddenly. It crept into Arthur's life little by little after his wife, Eleanor, passed away 6 years earlier. At first, neighbors still visited. Old friends still invited him fishing. But time moved differently after grief. People slowly stopped calling. The town changed. New cafes replaced hardware stores. Luxury condos rose near the marina. Teenagers walked past his shop staring at glowing screens without ever looking up at the windows filled with radios and antique lamps. One afternoon, Arthur overheard a teenage boy laugh while pointing toward the shop. "Looks like a museum for dead stuff," he had said. His friends laughed as they kept walking. Arthur never mentioned the comment to anyone, but that night he stayed in the workshop until nearly midnight polishing an old Zenith radio that nobody would probably ever buy. Because the truth was, the radios were never just radios to him. Every object carried someone's story, someone's memory, someone's life. A stopped clock meant a moment somebody wished had never ended. A cracked record player meant dances in kitchens long gone. A broken typewriter meant letters that were never finished. Arthur understood those things because he, too, felt like something the modern world no longer knew what to do with. On quiet evenings, he still caught himself making 2 cups of tea before remembering there was nobody left to drink the second one. The small apartment above the repair shop felt colder every winter. Some nights, he left the radio playing softly beside his bed just to hear another voice in the room. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning near the end of October, the bell above the front door rang, and everything began to change. Arthur looked up from his workbench expecting another delivery driver or someone asking for directions. Instead, an elderly woman stood quietly in the doorway holding an old wooden radio against her chest like it was something fragile enough to break all over again. Rainwater dripped from the edge of her coat. Her silver hair was pinned neatly beneath a knitted hat, and her tired blue eyes moved slowly across the crowded shelves of the repair shop before finally resting on Arthur himself. "I know this may sound foolish," she said softly, stepping closer to the counter, "but my husband used to listen to this radio every single night before he passed away. It stopped working the same evening he did. I was wondering if maybe you could help me hear his favorite song one more time." Arthur took the radio carefully from the woman's hands and placed it on the workbench beneath the hanging brass lamp. The wooden frame was scratched near the corners, and one of the knobs was missing entirely, but he recognized the model immediately. A 1968 Emerson tube radio. The kind built heavy enough to survive decades if somebody cared for it properly. Most people no longer did. The woman removed her damp gloves slowly while Arthur examined the back panel. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said softly. "My husband Frank used to listen to jazz every night before bed. He would sit near the kitchen window with this radio beside him and a cup of black coffee in his hands." Her voice trembled slightly near the end of the sentence, but she smiled anyway. Arthur nodded gently. "Arthur Whitmore," he replied. "I remember these radios well. They were built to last longer than the people who bought them." Eleanor glanced around the repair shop while rain tapped softly against the windows. Shelves crowded with old clocks and rusted fans stretched toward the ceiling. Small drawers filled with screws and wires lined the back wall beside faded photographs Arthur had never bothered taking down. The place smelled faintly of machine oil, cedar wood, and old paper. To most people, it probably looked cluttered, forgotten, but Eleanor did not seem uncomfortable there. In fact, she looked relieved, as though she had finally stepped inside a place where time moved at the same speed as her memories. Arthur carefully unscrewed the radio casing while Eleanor sat quietly in the chair beside the counter. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence inside the shop felt peaceful instead of awkward. Outside, the ocean fog rolled slowly across Harbor Street, while passing cars sprayed rainwater onto the sidewalks. Arthur adjusted his glasses and studied the damaged wiring beneath the tubes. "The capacitor burned out years ago," he said. "That is why it went silent." Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the floor. "It stopped the same night Frank passed away," she whispered. Arthur paused for a moment before reaching for a small metal toolbox. "Machines are strange sometimes," he said carefully. "People think they are only wires and screws. But after enough years around somebody, they start carrying pieces of a life." Eleanor smiled sadly at that. Frank used to say this radio knew more secrets than most people. Arthur spent the next several hours repairing the old machine while Eleanor remained in the shop drinking tea from a chipped ceramic mug he found near the sink. Customers rarely stayed anymore. Most people dropped things off quickly before hurrying back into their busy lives. But Eleanor stayed all afternoon listening to the ticking clocks and the distant sound of waves crashing against the harbor rocks. For the first time in years, the repair shop did not feel empty. Near sunset, Arthur finally leaned back from the workbench and wiped his hands with a cloth. "Let us see if your husband still remembers his favorite station," he said quietly. Eleanor stood slowly as Arthur plugged the radio into the outlet near the counter. For a second, nothing happened except a low electrical hum. Then soft static crackled through the speaker. Arthur adjusted the tuning dial carefully with his fingertips. More static. A whistle of interference. And suddenly, faint piano music drifted into the room like a voice returning from very far away. Eleanor covered her mouth immediately. Her shoulders trembled as the melody filled the shop. Arthur recognized the song at once. Moon River. Frank Sinatra's voice floated softly through the old speaker while rain streaked down the front windows in silver lines. Eleanor began crying before the first chorus even finished. Not loud crying. Not dramatic. Just quiet tears falling into trembling hands while she stared at the radio like she had been given one final evening with her husband. Arthur looked away politely and pretended to organize tools on the workbench. After 6 years alone, he understood there were certain moments grief returned without warning. Sometimes all it took was a song. Outside the shop, a young man wearing a delivery jacket slowed near the window after noticing Eleanor crying beside the glowing radio. He pulled out his phone and quietly recorded a short video through the rain-covered glass. Inside, neither Arthur nor Eleanor noticed. They remained standing beside the old Emerson radio while Sinatra's voice filled the repair shop with warmth that had been missing there for far too long. By the next morning, the video had already begun spreading across Cedar Bay. Arthur did not know the video existed until the following afternoon when a teenage boy walked into the repair shop, holding a cracked portable speaker beneath one arm. The boy looked around awkwardly before placing the speaker on the counter. "You are the guy from the video, right?" he asked. Arthur glanced up from a half-repaired table lamp. "I'm not sure what you mean." The teenager pulled out his phone and turned the screen around. There, beneath thousands of comments and glowing little hearts, was a blurry recording of Eleanor standing beside the radio while Moon River played softly through the old speaker. The rain against the windows, the warm light above the workbench. Arthur quietly organizing tools while Eleanor cried into trembling hands. Someone had added the words, "An old repairman in Cedar Bay fixed more than a radio tonight." Arthur stared at the screen for several seconds without speaking. He had spent years becoming invisible inside his own town. Now suddenly strangers from places he had never visited were leaving comments about kindness and memories and grandparents they missed. The teenager shrugged awkwardly. "My grandma shared it this morning. She cried for like 20 minutes. Arthur handed the phone back carefully. "Well," he said softly, "I suppose your speaker needs fixing." The boy smiled slightly. "Actually, I mostly just wanted to see the shop." That sentence lingered with Arthur long after the boy left. By Friday morning, more people began appearing at Whitmore Repair Shop than Arthur had seen in years. Some brought broken items. Others simply wandered in out of curiosity after seeing the video online. An older man wearing a navy windbreaker carried a rusted wall clock wrapped in a towel beneath his arm. A retired schoolteacher brought a yellowed typewriter case covered in dust. A widow arrived carrying a wooden jewelry box with a broken music mechanism inside. Arthur noticed something strange almost immediately. Nobody seemed rushed. People stayed longer than necessary. They walked slowly through the crowded aisles looking at antique radios and faded photographs on the walls while soft jazz played from a speaker near the front counter. For the first time in years, voices filled the repair shop again. Laughter returned in small, careful pieces, like sunlight entering through old curtains. Around 3 in the afternoon, the man with the wall clock finally explained why he had come. "This stopped working the same day my son moved to Chicago," he said quietly while Arthur examined the gears inside the clock casing. "I always meant to fix it, but after my wife died, I stopped caring much about things." Arthur nodded slowly while adjusting his glasses. Sometimes people stop fixing things because they think nobody else notices they are broken. The man looked at him for a moment before smiling sadly. "You understand that better than most." Over the next week, the repair shop transformed in ways Arthur could barely explain. Eleanor Hayes began visiting almost every afternoon with homemade oatmeal cookies wrapped in wax paper. Samuel Brooks, an 80-year-old Army veteran with rough hands and a permanent limp, started helping Arthur organize spare parts in the back room after mentioning he used to repair radios during storms overseas decades earlier. A retired librarian named Dorothy spent hours polishing antique lamps near the front window while quietly humming songs from the 1950s. Nobody officially planned any of it. People simply kept returning. One rainy evening Arthur walked downstairs from his apartment carrying a tray with 6 mismatched coffee mugs only to stop halfway down the stairs in surprise. The repair shop was full. Samuel sat near the workbench teaching a younger man how to reconnect damaged speaker wires. Eleanor and Dorothy were laughing softly beside the old record player while a jazz station crackled faintly through the speakers. Someone had brought fresh blueberry pie. Somebody else had repaired one of the broken wooden chairs near the front counter without being asked. Arthur stood silently near the staircase for several seconds listening to the sounds drifting through the room. It had been years since the building felt alive after sunset. Samuel looked up first and noticed him standing there. "Arthur," he called, "you still hiding the good coffee upstairs?" A few people laughed. Arthur shook his head gently before carrying the mugs toward the counter. "Depends," he answered. "Are any of you planning on burning the place down while fixing those wires?" More laughter filled the room. Warm laughter. The kind Arthur thought had disappeared from his life forever. Later that evening, after everyone finally left, Arthur remained alone beside the front window watching fog drift across Harbor Street beneath the yellow streetlights. The repair shop no longer sounded empty behind him. Tools rested across crowded tables. Half-repaired radios hummed softly on shelves. Coffee cups sat beside stacks of old magazines. Tiny signs of human presence remained everywhere. Arthur slowly removed his glasses and looked around the room. For the first time in many years, Whitmore Repair Shop no longer felt like a place where forgotten objects came to die. It felt like something else entirely. Something still waiting to be rebuilt. By the middle of November, people in Cedar Bay had started calling the little gathering inside the repair shop the Fixers Club, though nobody remembered exactly who said it first. The name simply appeared one afternoon after a local waitress brought coffee for everyone and taped a handwritten sign near the front register that read, "Free refills for the fixers." Arthur pretended not to notice the sign at first, but later that evening he carefully smoothed the corners flat after everyone went home. The repair shop had settled into a rhythm now. Every morning Arthur still unlocked the door at 7:30 sharp, but instead of silence waiting for him, there were usually notes slipped beneath the entrance overnight. Old radios needing repairs. Small thank you cards. Sometimes people simply left cookies or jars of homemade jam beside the front steps. One note written in shaky handwriting said, "Thank you for making this town feel warm again." Arthur folded that one carefully and kept it inside the drawer beneath the cash register. The afternoons became the busiest. Samuel Brooks usually arrived first carrying a dented metal toolbox older than most of the tourists visiting Cedar Bay. He never smiled much, but he stayed longer every day. Arthur noticed the veteran no longer limped as heavily inside the shop as he did outside. Dorothy organized shelves with the seriousness of somebody restoring a library after a storm. Eleanor Hayes often sat near the front window helping children polish old brass lamps, while jazz records played softly nearby. Sometimes teenagers wandered in pretending they were only curious about the antiques, but Arthur noticed many of them returned a second time, and then a third. One cold Thursday afternoon, a little girl named Lucy Bennett entered the shop holding a broken flashlight almost bigger than her arm. She could not have been older than 8 years old. "Mom said you fix important things," she explained seriously while placing the flashlight on the counter. Arthur adjusted his glasses and examined the toy carefully. "This looks very serious indeed," he replied. Lucy nodded. "It was my dad's fishing flashlight. It stopped working last month." Arthur unscrewed the battery compartment while Lucy watched every movement with wide eyes. "Do you know how flashlights work?" he asked. She shook her head. Arthur motioned toward the stool beside the workbench. "Then I suppose today is a good day to learn." That afternoon became the beginning of something unexpected. Other children started appearing after school carrying broken bicycles, cracked radios, and tangled Christmas lights. Arthur never charged them. Instead, he taught them slowly and patiently how to repair things with their own hands. Samuel showed 2 teenage boys how to reconnect loose wiring inside an old speaker system. Dorothy taught a shy little girl how to restore scratches from a wooden jewelry box using polish and soft cloth. Eleanor sat beside Lucy teaching her how to clean radio tubes without damaging the fragile glass. The repair shop no longer felt like a business. It felt like a place people needed. One evening Arthur stood quietly near the back room, watching Lucy carefully tighten screws into the flashlight she had spent 3 days repairing herself. Her small hands trembled with concentration. "There," she whispered after finally switching it on. A bright beam of light filled the workshop. Lucy smiled so proudly that Samuel actually laughed out loud from across the room. "Well, I will be," he muttered. "Kid fixed it better than most adults." Lucy looked toward Arthur immediately. "Do you think my dad will like it?" she asked. Arthur swallowed gently before answering. "I think your father is going to remember this flashlight for the rest of his life." Later that night, after everyone left, Arthur climbed the narrow stairs toward his apartment carrying a cardboard box filled with loose radio parts. Halfway upstairs, he stopped suddenly. The repair shop below was glowing softly beneath the hanging lamps. Coffee mugs sat scattered across work tables beside half-repaired clocks and old newspapers. Somebody had left blueberry muffins wrapped in foil near the record player. Samuel's coat still hung over one chair because he forgot it again. Arthur slowly sat down on the staircase and looked at the room below. 6 months earlier, he had spent entire evenings staring at the walls wondering whether he should finally close the shop forever. Now there were fingerprints on the windows from children pressing their faces against the glass. There were voices inside these walls again. Laughter. Stories. Life. Arthur lowered his eyes toward his rough hands resting against the cardboard box. For years he believed the world no longer needed people like him. Old. Men with outdated skills. Men who still repaired things instead of replacing them. But now every evening the lights inside Whitmore Repair Shop stayed on later than the streetlights outside, and little by little, the lonely people of Cedar Bay stopped feeling quite so forgotten. Winter arrived early in Cedar Bay that year. By the first week of December, cold ocean winds swept through Harbor Street hard enough to rattle the old windows inside the repair shop, and the smell of salt water lingered in the air long after sunset. Arthur Whitmore began arriving even earlier each morning to light the small heater near the workbench before everyone else showed up. He never officially invited people to gather there every day, but somehow they always came. By noon, the little repair shop usually glowed with warm light and quiet conversation while rain tapped softly against the roof. One afternoon, Noah Carter walked into the shop carrying a camera bag over one shoulder and a cardboard tray filled with hot chocolate cups. Noah was 26 years old and worked freelance jobs filming weddings and local events around town. Arthur recognized him immediately as the young man who had recorded the video of Eleanor and the radio weeks earlier. "Thought you people might need fuel," Noah said while setting the drinks beside the register. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You calling us old people now?" Noah laughed nervously. "I mean, experienced people." Eleanor smiled into her tea while Dorothy shook her head. Arthur quietly handed Noah one of the repaired stools near the workbench. "Sit down before Samuel scares you back into the ocean." Noah started visiting regularly after that. Sometimes he filmed small clips of people repairing things together inside the shop. Nothing dramatic. Samuel teaching Lucy how to reconnect wires. Eleanor polishing brass radio knobs beside Dorothy. Arthur carefully restoring an old tabletop fan while soft jazz played in the background. Noah said people online liked watching hands fix things slowly. It calms them down, he explained one evening while adjusting camera settings near the front window. Arthur never fully understood why strangers cared about his repair shop, but he noticed something changing around Cedar Bay. More people began stopping outside the windows to watch. Children waved when Arthur swept the sidewalk each morning. Local businesses started donating supplies without being asked. A bakery down the street dropped off fresh bread every Friday. Even the hardware store owner offered discounted tools after seeing one of Noah's videos online. For the first time in years, Harbor Street itself felt alive again. Then came the town meeting. Arthur almost did not attend. He rarely involved himself in local politics anymore, but Samuel insisted they should all go after hearing rumors around the marina. The meeting took place inside the Cedar Bay Community Center on a freezing Thursday evening. Folding chairs filled the room, while residents bundled in heavy coats murmured quietly beneath fluorescent lights. Arthur sat near the back beside Eleanor, Samuel, Dorothy, and Lucy's parents. Noah stood nearby holding his camera, but had not started recording yet. At exactly 7 o'clock, Mayor Margaret Collins stepped toward the microphone carrying a thick folder beneath one arm. Arthur immediately noticed the worried expression on her face. "As many of you know," she began carefully, "the City Council has approved preliminary plans for the Harborfront Renewal Project." A large map appeared on the screen behind her showing bright new hotels, restaurants, luxury apartments, and shopping areas stretching across the old waterfront district. Arthur stared quietly at the glowing image while a cold feeling settled into his chest. Then Mayor Collins pointed toward a section marked for demolition. Harbor Street. Whitmore Repair Shop sat directly in the center. The room filled with mixed reactions. Some younger business owners nodded approvingly. Others whispered uncertainly. Tyler Grant, whose family owned a chain of beachfront properties nearby, stood near the front smiling confidently while discussing tourism revenue with several investors. "The old district is dying anyway," Tyler said loudly enough for half the room to hear. "People want modern businesses now. Nobody comes to Harbor Street except retirees and tourists looking for antiques." Arthur lowered his eyes toward his rough hands resting against the chair. He did not say anything. Around him, silence slowly spread through the group from the repair shop. Eleanor's face had gone pale. Dorothy folded her hands tightly in her lap. Samuel stared toward the floor with a distant expression Arthur recognized immediately from old soldiers who had learned not to expect good news anymore. Then Tyler glanced toward Arthur directly. "No offense, Mr. Whitmore," he added casually, "but places like that repair shop are basically museums for old junk now." The words settled heavily inside the room. Nobody answered him. Arthur simply sat there quietly while people continued discussing budgets and construction plans around him. But something inside him shifted during that moment. Because for the first time in months, the warmth growing inside the repair shop suddenly felt fragile. Temporary. Like a light flickering against a storm that was slowly moving closer. The mood inside the repair shop changed after the town meeting, though nobody admitted it out loud at first. The laughter grew quieter. Conversations drifted into long silences whenever the demolition plans were mentioned. Even the jazz music playing from the old speakers seemed softer somehow, as though the building itself had overheard what was coming. Arthur noticed the changes immediately. Samuel stopped staying late after sunset and usually left before dinner carrying his toolbox beneath one arm, without saying much. Dorothy still polished lamps near the front window, but her movements had become slower, distracted. Eleanor continued bringing tea and cookies, yet Arthur often caught her staring toward the harbor through the rain-streaked windows with distant eyes. One cold Monday afternoon, only 3 people showed up. Arthur stood near the workbench repairing an old transistor radio while snow mixed with rain outside. The shop felt larger when it was empty. The ticking clocks sounded louder again. Lucy Bennett arrived after school carrying her flashlight and sat quietly beside Samuel for almost an hour without speaking. Finally, she looked up at Arthur. "Are they really going to tear this place down?" she asked softly. Arthur hesitated before answering. "I do not know yet." Lucy lowered her eyes toward the floor. "But where will everybody go?" Nobody answered her. Samuel simply removed his glasses and rubbed tired fingers across his face, while Dorothy quietly folded polishing cloths beside the front counter. That question stayed with Arthur long after everyone left. Because the truth was, Whitmore Repair Shop had become more than a repair shop now. It had become the only place many of them still felt useful. The only place where nobody cared how old they were or how slowly they walked or whether their hands shook while holding tools. Arthur understood that better than anyone. The following week, official notices appeared taped to storefront windows across Harbor Street. Redevelopment approved. Property acquisition process begins January 15th. Arthur stood silently reading the paper attached beside his front door while icy wind swept through the street. Across the road, workers had already started measuring buildings for future demolition. Bright orange paint marked sections of sidewalk near the marina. Cedar Bay suddenly felt unfamiliar to him, like somebody had quietly decided the old version of the town no longer mattered. That afternoon, fewer people visited the shop than ever before. Eleanor arrived briefly but left early claiming she had a headache. Samuel spent most of the day organizing tools in silence. Even Noah Carter seemed unsettled while filming near the front window. Around sunset, Tyler Grant walked past the repair shop with 2 investors wearing expensive coats and polished shoes. Arthur overheard one of them laugh while pointing toward the building. "That place still open?" the man asked. Tyler smirked. "Barely. Once construction starts, this whole block is finally getting dragged into the 21st century." Arthur kept working without looking up, but Samuel's jaw tightened visibly across the room. After the men disappeared down Harbor Street, Samuel placed a screwdriver onto the workbench harder than necessary. People act like old things have no value just because they survived longer than they did, he muttered. Arthur quietly adjusted the tuning dial on the radio in front of him. "They are afraid of reminders," he replied softly. "Old things remind people that time keeps moving whether they are ready or not." Samuel looked around the shop slowly. "You thinking about giving up?" Arthur did not answer immediately. He stared toward the shelves crowded with clocks, radios, and half-repaired lamps glowing beneath warm yellow light. For months the repair shop had felt alive again. But now uncertainty hung over everything like approaching winter fog. "I spent 6 years preparing myself for this place to disappear," Arthur finally admitted. "I just did not expect people to start needing it again first." Later that evening, after everyone left, Arthur remained alone inside the repair shop long past midnight. Snow drifted softly outside the windows while Harbor Street sat quiet beneath pale streetlights. He walked slowly through the shop, turning off lamps one by one. Near the back room, he paused beside an old bulletin board covered with photographs Noah had printed over the past few months. Lucy smiling proudly beside her repaired flashlight. Eleanor laughing while holding a restored radio. Samuel teaching teenagers how to reconnect wiring. Dorothy polishing antique lamps beneath Christmas decorations. Arthur stared at the photographs for a very long time. Then he noticed something he had not realized before. Every picture showed people fixing something together. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. Because for a little while, inside these walls, they stopped feeling invisible. Arthur slowly sat down beside the workbench and looked around the dim repair shop. The building creaked softly against the winter wind outside. Somewhere near the harbor, a foghorn echoed across the dark water. Arthur lowered his tired eyes toward his hands resting on the table. Hands the world had nearly convinced him were no longer needed. And for the first time in months, fear quietly returned to his chest. Not fear of losing the building. Fear of watching all those lonely people become forgotten again. 3 days before Christmas, Noah Carter uploaded a new video. Just before midnight. He almost did not post it at all. The footage had been sitting unfinished on his computer for nearly 2 weeks while snow drifted outside his apartment window and demolition rumors spread through Cedar Bay like cold wine through broken doors. But after leaving the repair shop that evening and seeing Arthur sitting alone beneath the dim workshop lights long after everyone else had gone home, Noah finally opened the editing software and began piecing the clips together. The video started simply. Samuel Brooks repairing a little boy's bicycle tire while pretending not to smile. Eleanor Hayes teaching Lucy Bennett how to polish old brass radio knobs beside a table covered in cookie crumbs and coffee mugs. Dorothy laughing softly while Christmas music crackled through a repaired speaker. Arthur Whitmore carefully adjusting the hands on a broken wedding clock while snow fell outside the shop windows. Noah added no dramatic narration. Only quiet piano music beneath the sounds already captured in the room. Laughter, teacups clinking, tools tapping gently against wood, human voices filling empty spaces. Near the end of the video, Noah included a short clip he secretly filmed one evening after everyone else had left. Arthur stood alone inside the repair shop turning off lights one by one before pausing beside Lucy's repaired flashlight resting near the counter. He picked it up carefully, smiled to himself for just a second, then placed it back down beside Samuel's toolbox. Noah stared at that clip for a long time before finally adding a sentence across the screen. Maybe old people are not falling behind. Maybe we just stopped listening. Then he posted the video and went to sleep. By morning, everything had changed again. Noah woke to hundreds of missed notifications flooding his phone. The video had spread far beyond Cedar Bay overnight. Thousands of people were sharing it across social media with stories about grandparents they missed, fathers who fixed everything around the house, mothers who taught them how to sew buttons or repair bicycles or cook family recipes nobody else remembered anymore. Comments poured in from every corner of the country. This reminds me of my grandfather's garage. I would give anything to hear my grandma's radio again. Please protect places like this. By noon, the video had passed 2 million views. Reporters started calling Noah asking about the repair shop near the harbor. Strangers mailed donations. Someone from Chicago shipped boxes of antique radio parts with a handwritten note saying, "For the people keeping old things alive." Arthur had no idea any of this was happening until the front bell above the shop door rang nonstop for nearly 2 straight hours. People crowded inside carrying broken lamps, clocks, radios, and old family photographs. Some customers drove over 100 miles just to see the repair shop from the video. Others came only to shake Arthur's hand. "My dad used to repair televisions in Oklahoma," one man told him while wiping tears from his eyes. "Watching your shop reminded me of him." Arthur stood quietly through most of it, looking overwhelmed by the sudden attention. He had spent years becoming invisible. Now strangers looked at him with gratitude he did not know how to carry. By evening, local news vans lined Harbor Street beneath falling snow, while reporters filmed the glowing windows of Whitmore Repair Shop. Tyler Grant walked past the crowd twice that afternoon, wearing an expression Arthur could not quite read. For the first time since the redevelopment announcement, Harbor Street no longer looked abandoned. It looked important. Inside the shop, warmth returned almost immediately. Samuel spent the afternoon teaching teenagers how to repair bicycle chains, while Dorothy organized donated supplies stacked near the back room. Eleanor sat beside Lucy, helping her write thank you cards to strangers who mailed small gifts after seeing the video. The old repair shop buzzed with life so fully that Arthur barely recognized the place anymore. Around sunset, Noah entered carrying printed copies of online comments and newspaper headlines. "People are calling this place the heart of Cedar Bay," he said breathlessly. Arthur shook his head slowly while tightening screws into an old tabletop radio. "It is only a repair shop." Noah smiled softly. "No, Arthur. It stopped being only a repair shop a long time ago." Arthur looked around the room then. Samuel laughing quietly beside 2 teenagers repairing a speaker system. Eleanor pouring tea for visitors she had never met before. Lucy sitting cross-legged on the floor teaching another little girl how to replace flashlight batteries. Outside the windows, snow continued falling across Harbor Street while strangers gathered beneath glowing Christmas lights to photograph the old repair shop everyone suddenly seemed desperate to save. Arthur lowered his eyes toward the worn wooden counter beneath his hands. For years he believed the world had no place left for people like him. But now, watching the crowded room filled with lonely people who no longer looked lonely at all, he began to understand something quietly extraordinary. Sometimes broken things only needed somebody willing to sit beside them long enough to care. The storm arrived just after midnight on the first Sunday of January. Weather reports had warned Cedar Bay about heavy rain and strong coastal winds, but nobody expected the ocean to turn violent so quickly. By 11:30, waves slammed hard enough against the harbor walls to shake windows across town. The wind howled through Harbor Street like a freight train, while freezing rain hammered rooftops and power lines. Arthur Whitmore was asleep upstairs when the electricity suddenly failed. The small lamp beside his bed flickered once before the apartment fell completely dark. Seconds later, thunder rolled across the coastline so deeply that the floorboards trembled beneath his feet. Arthur slowly sat up listening to the storm outside. Then he heard something else. Knocking. Fast and desperate. He pulled on his coat and hurried downstairs through the dark repair shop using a flashlight near the staircase. The moment he opened the front door, freezing wind burst inside, carrying rainwater across the floorboards. Noah Carter stood outside, soaked completely through. "Arthur," he shouted above the storm. "The entire harbor lost power. Cell towers are down too." Another crash echoed somewhere near the marina. The street outside had disappeared beneath darkness except for emergency vehicle lights flickering faintly in the distance. Arthur immediately turned toward the back room, where the old generator sat beneath shelves filled with radio parts. "Help me start it," he said calmly. Within minutes, warm yellow light glowed once again inside the repair shop, while the rest of Harbor Street remained black. One by one, people began arriving through the storm. Samuel Brooks carrying flashlights beneath his coat. Eleanor Hayes wrapped in a heavy blanket. Lucy Bennett clinging tightly to her mother's hand while rain dripped from their jackets onto the floor. More neighbors followed close behind seeking warmth, light, and information. But there was almost none to give. Phones had stopped working completely. Internet service vanished across the entire coastline. Fishing boats still trapped offshore could not contact the harbor because modern radio systems at the marina had failed during the blackout. Fear spread quietly through the crowded repair shop, while wine screamed outside the windows. Then Lucy's mother suddenly covered her mouth with trembling hands. "My husband is still out there," she whispered. "He left before sunset." Lucy immediately burst into tears. "Daddy promised he would come home tonight." The room fell silent except for the storm outside. Arthur looked toward the frightened faces gathered around the repair shop. People clutching dead cell phones that no longer mattered. Modern systems had failed all at once. But Arthur's eyes slowly moved towards something resting beneath a canvas covered near the back wall. An old military field radio Samuel had repaired months earlier just for the pleasure of hearing it work again. Arthur walked toward it quietly while Samuel immediately understood. The veteran stood without a word and moved beside him. Eleanor grabbed flashlights. Noah cleared space near the workbench. Nobody needed instructions. The old repair shop suddenly transformed into something focused and urgent. Samuel connected wiring with steady hands while Arthur adjusted knobs and checked vacuum tubes beneath dim yellow light. Dorothy held a flashlight over the workbench while Noah searched drawers for spare batteries. Lucy watched silently through tears as the older people around her moved with calm precision the modern world had long stopped noticing. Outside, Cedar Bay remained trapped in darkness. Inside the repair shop, old hands worked steadily together. Arthur switched on the field radio. At first there was only static. Sharp bursts of interference crackled through the speaker while rain slammed against the windows. Arthur adjusted the frequency carefully. More static. Samuel tightened loose wiring connections near the battery unit. Eleanor steadied the flashlight while Noah climbed onto a chair to reposition the emergency antenna near the ceiling beam. Then suddenly a faint voice cut through the noise. "Coast Guard Vessel 14 responding." Everyone froze instantly. Arthur leaned closer, adjusting the dial with incredible care. The voice returned clearer this time. This is Coast Guard Vessel 14. We are receiving weak civilian transmission signals near Cedar Bay Harbor. Lucy gasped beside her mother. Tears rolled down Eleanor's cheeks while Samuel pressed headphones tighter against one ear listening for coordinates. Arthur calmly picked up the microphone. This is Whitmore Repair Shop on Harbor Street, he said steadily. We have families here unable to contact fishing vessels offshore. More static crackled. Then the answer came back through the speaker loud enough for the entire room to hear. We hear you, Whitmore Repair Shop. Rescue teams are already moving toward the harbor now. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the storm outside and the faint hum of old radio equipment glowing beneath warm yellow light. Then Lucy ran forward and wrapped both arms around Arthur's waist, crying into his coat, while her mother covered her face in relief. Around the room, exhausted people looked toward Arthur, Samuel, Eleanor, and the others with something that had not existed before tonight. Respect. Real respect. Arthur slowly removed his glasses and wiped rainwater from the lenses while the old military radio crackled softly beside him. Then he looked around the crowded repair shop and quietly said the words nobody there would ever forget. The world moved on too fast, he murmured gently. But some things were never supposed to be replaced. The storm finally passed sometime before dawn. By sunrise, Cedar Bay looked exhausted. Tree branches littered Harbor Street. Storefront windows were coated in salt water and rain. Parts of the marina remained flooded while emergency crews moved slowly through neighborhoods restoring power block by block. But something inside the town had changed during the long night inside the repair shop. People spoke differently now. Softer, more thoughtful. News about what happened spread quickly after electricity returned. Residents shared photos online showing elderly neighbors gathered around glowing radios inside Whitmore Repair Shop while the rest of the harbor sat dark beyond the windows. Local newspapers published headlines calling the repair shop the heartbeat of Cedar Bay during the blackout. Even television crews arrived from nearby cities wanting interviews with Arthur and the others. Arthur avoided most of them politely. He still preferred standing quietly behind his workbench repairing old machines while life happened around him. But the town no longer looked at him the same way. 3 days after the storm, Mayor Margaret Collins visited the repair shop carrying a thick folder beneath her arm. The building was crowded again that afternoon. Samuel repaired a record player near the front window while Lucy and 2 other children painted small wooden signs beside the heater. Eleanor poured tea for visitors arriving every few minutes carrying radios and clocks damaged during the blackout. The moment Mayor Collins entered, the room slowly quieted. Arthur removed his glasses and looked up from the lamp he was restoring. The mayor smiled gently before stepping toward the counter. Arthur, she said softly, the city council held an emergency meeting this morning. Samuel lowered his screwdriver immediately. Eleanor stopped pouring tea. Even the children looked up from their paintbrushes. Mayor Collins opened the folder carefully and placed several papers onto the counter. The Harborfront Renewal Project has officially been revised, she announced. The old waterfront district will remain protected under Cedar Bay historical preservation status. For a second, nobody reacted. The words almost felt too large to understand. Then Dorothy quietly covered her mouth with trembling fingers while Samuel leaned back in his chair staring toward the ceiling as though he needed a moment to steady himself. Lucy jumped up so quickly her paint water nearly spilled across the floor. Does that mean the shop stays? She asked breathlessly. Mayor Collins smiled. Yes, sweetheart. The shop stays. The room erupted into laughter and relieved voices all at once. Samuel actually hugged Arthur hard enough to nearly knock his glasses sideways, while Eleanor cried openly beside the counter. Outside, people walking past the windows noticed the celebration and began gathering near the doorway, trying to understand what happened. Within an hour, Harbor Street was crowded again, not with investors or demolition crews, with neighbors, families, children riding bicycles through puddles while music drifted from repaired radios near the shop windows. That evening, Noah Carter arrived carrying a long wooden board wrapped carefully in cloth. A few people wanted to help make something, he explained. Arthur slowly unwrapped the board while the others gathered around. Painted across the wood in warm cream-colored letters were 4 simple words. The Warmest Place. Beneath the title, in smaller handwriting, another line had been added carefully in blue paint. where broken things still get a second chance. Lucy proudly raised her paint-stained hands. I wrote that part. Arthur stared at the sign for a long moment without speaking. Then very carefully, he ran rough fingertips across the painted letters as though touching something fragile and impossible at the same time. That night, the entire group helped hang the sign above the repair shop entrance while snow drifted softly across Harbor Street beneath glowing streetlights. People passing by stopped to watch. Some smiled quietly. Others wiped tears from their eyes after reading the words beneath the sign. Arthur stepped back onto the sidewalk after the work was finished and looked up at the building. The old paint still peeled near the windows. The wooden stairs still creaked. The roof still leaked slightly during heavy rain. But somehow the place looked different now. Alive. Warm. Needed. Later, after everyone finally went home, Arthur remained alone inside the repair shop listening to the soft crackle of an old jazz station playing through Eleanor's repaired Emerson radio near the workbench. Coffee mugs rested beside unfinished projects. Samuel's toolbox sat near the heater. Lucy's painted flashlight leaned against the register. Tiny traces of human presence filled every corner of the room. Arthur slowly turned off most of the lamps before walking toward the front window. Outside, fresh snow covered Harbor Street in silence while the new wooden sign swayed gently above the entrance. The warmest place. Arthur rested one tired hand against the glass and looked around the repair shop one final time before heading upstairs. For years he believed growing old meant becoming invisible little by little until the world finally forgot you completely. But now he understood something different. Sometimes people are not waiting to disappear. Sometimes they are only waiting for someone to remind them their light still matters. And beneath the warm glow of repaired lamps and softly humming radios, the lonely old repair shop by the sea continued shining quietly into the winter night.